For 150 years, this mountain has been winning. Men have thrown everything they had at it. Iron rails, dynamite, prison labor, 3 million cubic yards of moved earth, an entire interstate highway, and every single time they walked away thinking they had finally beaten it, they hadn't. This is Old Fort Mountain in western North Carolina, the eastern wall of the Blue Ridge, where Interstate 40 drops off the escarpment down toward the town of Old Fort and the Piedmont beyond. Up top, you're in Ridgecrest. 5 miles later, you're at the bottom, and in between is a grade that has been collecting trucks since before trucks existed. Look at the runaway ramps carved into the hillside. Nobody builds those for fun. They're scar tissue. Every one of them is there because somebody came down this hill with no way to stop, and the state got tired of scraping up what was left. Here's what makes this mountain different from every other grade you've run. They fixed it. They straightened the curves, they cut the grade, they built it to interstate standard decades before it was ever called Interstate 40. On paper, Old Fort is a solved problem. And it still kills experienced drivers. Men with 30 years behind the wheel. That's the part that should stop you cold. Because if a smooth modern interstate can do that to a veteran, then the danger was never really in the pavement. It's in the drop itself. And the drop does not care how good the road got. I'm going to take you down this hill the way it actually happens, not the postcard version. We're going to start 150 years ago with the first bodies this mountain took, and we're going to end on a Tuesday morning last summer with a man who did everything a lifetime of driving taught him to do and still didn't make it to the bottom. Buckle in and drop it into low gear. This one earns its reputation the whole way down. Before the highway, before the automobile, this gap was just a wall. The Blue Ridge escarpment stands up out of the Piedmont like the side of a table, and for anybody trying to connect Asheville to the rest of North Carolina, Swannanoa Gap was the only realistic way through. In the 1870s, they decided to run a railroad up it. The problem was that no free man in his right mind wanted the job, so the state didn't use free men. When Zebulon Vance became governor in 1877, he promised in his inauguration speech to send state convicts up the mountain, and that is exactly what he did. Prisoners out of the Central Prison in Raleigh marched into the mountains to dig, blast, haul, and fill their way up the Old Fort grade. Over the length of the project, more than 3,000 people worked that 9-mile line between Old Fort and Black Mountain, and by most accounts, at least 95% of them were incarcerated. Predominantly black men, many of them locked up on petty charges out of the eastern counties. Some of them were boys. Records put a few of them at 14 years old. They slept in locked boxcars until they built their own stockades. They bored 7 tunnels through solid rock with hand tools and black powder, and they died doing it. Not a handful, at least 139 men and some women died building this railroad, and that is the number people are confident about. The real figure is almost certainly higher, because a lot of them were buried fast and quiet in unmarked pits right beside the tracks, and more than 100 are still unaccounted for. There is a folk song that came off this grade, sung by the men who worked it, the Swannanoa Tunnel. The line everybody remembers goes, "All caved in, baby, all caved in." And it is not a metaphor. On May 11th, 1879, the crews digging from both ends of the Swannanoa Tunnel finally met, and the man in charge wired the governor a triumphant message that daylight had entered Buncombe County. Right after that telegram went out, the tunnel caved in and crushed 20 more men to death. That is how this mountain introduced itself to the modern world. Before a single truck ever touched it, before there was a road worth the name, Old Fort had already run up a body count most highways never reach in a century. The rails got through. The mountain just made everyone pay first. And the rails, it turned out, were not going to be enough, because a whole new machine was coming, and it wanted a road. By the early 1900s, Americans had discovered the automobile, and the automobile needed something better than a railroad grade. In 1911, North Carolina authorized what they called the Central Highway, a route meant to run clear across the state. At Old Fort, that meant climbing the same escarpment the convicts had bored through, up through Swannanoa Gap toward Ridgecrest and Black Mountain. They did not carve a brand new road out of the mountainside. They took the existing roads, the ones that followed the natural shape of the land, and stitched them together. When the state started numbering its highways instead of naming them, the Central Highway became North Carolina 10. When the federal system came in around 1926, it changed again and became part of US Route 70. And Old 70 climbed this mountain the way roads used to climb mountains, by giving up and going with the terrain. Not the sweeping engineered curves you know now. Switchbacks, hairpins, the road working its way back and forth across the face of the grade, one tight turn after another. For a driver, crossing here was not a few minutes of highway. It was 20-30 minutes of wrestling the wheel. That slowness built a whole world along the road. There was a place up above Old Fort called Point Lookout, perched on the mountainside, where travelers stopped for gas and food and souvenirs. There were cabins to stay in. For a while, there were even performing bears. But the real draw was just the view, standing up there looking out across the gorge toward the Piedmont laid out below you. But that old road had a nasty side. It was beautiful, and it was deadly. Between Old Fort and Ridgecrest, US Route 70 ran about 8 miles and packed in 98 curves, a lot of them hairpins. Put the brakes and the tires and the safety equipment of a 1940s truck on 98 curves down a mountain, and you get exactly what you would expect. Most accounts from the time put the wrecks on this stretch at 20 to 30 a year, year after year. So by the early 1950s, North Carolina made a decision. They were not going to keep patching the old road. State officials flat out called it outdated, a highway that wound tortuously up the mountain. And this time, they were not going to work around the terrain. This time, they were going to move the mountain. On September 21, 1951, the state awarded a contract for $2.3 million to build an entirely new road up Old Fort Mountain. Not a repaved version of the old one, a completely new alignment, 6 and a fraction miles long, between Old Fort and Ridgecrest. Think about what they were replacing. 98 curves. The new road would have 19, and they would not be white-knuckle hairpins. They would be broad, sweeping, engineered curves, the kind you can actually hold at speed. The road would climb 1,326 feet over about 5 miles. To make that happen, they had to rip the mountain apart. The cuts they blasted into the rock ran 150 feet deep. The fills they built up ran 200 feet high. All told, the job moved more than 3.3 million cubic yards of rock and earth. That number does not mean much until you put it somewhere you can see it. Take a football field, end zones and all, fill it with dirt. To hold 3.3 million cubic yards, you would have to pile that dirt more than 1,600 feet deep. That is taller than most skyscrapers, standing on a football field made of nothing but the mountain they cut out of the way. And all of this, remember, North Carolina did on its own, years before the interstate system came through, years before this was ever officially Interstate 40. That is how badly they wanted this grade fixed. They basically built an interstate by hand to solve one mountain, except they did not solve it. They created a new problem, and it is the exact problem that still bites drivers today. The old road with its 98 curves was miserable, but it had one accidental safety feature. It was so twisted that you physically could not build up much speed. The mountain would not let you. Every hairpin scrubbed you back down. The new road took all of that away. Now you had smooth, broad curves and a clean grade, which meant a heavy truck could come over the top of Old Fort Mountain, carrying speed the old road would never have allowed. The rebuild did not make the mountain gentler, it made it faster. It handed every driver enough rope to really hurt himself, and it did it in the name of safety. By the 1970s, this stretch of US Route 70 was already being used as a stand-in for Interstate 40, even though it would not officially carry that shield until 1982. Heavier trucks, higher speeds, same drop off the east side. And the people responsible for this road figured out very quickly that they had built something that needed watching. Because the one thing all that engineering could not change was what happens to a loaded rig when the brakes are gone. If you drive a truck over 10,000 pounds eastbound over this mountain today, you do not just roll down it. You are required to stop first. Near the top of Old Fort Mountain, there is a truck information station. You pull in, you come to a red light, and you sit there while you read the information about the grade ahead and the truck speed limit before you are released back onto the highway. That is not a courtesy. That is the state putting a hand on your chest at the top of the hill and making you think for a second before you commit. This is not new either. A Federal Highway Administration report from 1978 laid out exactly what drivers ran into here even back then. At the top, the information station with its traffic control light. About 2 miles down, a pull-off where a driver could stop again, check the truck over, and let overheated brakes cool. Warning signs the whole way down. 50 years ago, this mountain was already designed to keep handing truckers one more chance to make a good decision before the grade took the decision away from them. And then there are the ramps. In 1974, engineers installed 2 experimental escape areas about 3 miles below the top. Today, you would recognize them instantly as runaway truck ramps, but at the time, the term was not even settled yet. North Carolina called them sand piles. The report described them as two arrestor beds, each around 340 feet long, set only about 200 feet apart, so that if one already had a truck buried in it, the other would still be open. Sit with that detail for a second. They built the second ramp because they expected the first one to be occupied. That is the level of runaway traffic this mountain was already producing back in the 70s. So picture the descent the way it is laid out for you. You stop at the top, you get told, in writing, how steep it is and how slow to go. Trucks are held to 35 miles an hour down this grade. You get a place to cool your brakes partway. You get warning signs practically grabbing your collar. And you get 3 emergency ramps built into the mountain sitting right there waiting for the express purpose of saving your life if it all goes wrong. Old Fort gives you more warnings and more outs than almost any grade in America. The mountain is practically begging you to come down it slow and in control. Most drivers hear it. They gear down, they ride the engine brake, they take the whole thing cold and boring the way the professionals do, and they roll into the town of Old Fort at the bottom without a story to tell. But every warning sign, every cooling pull-off, every ramp on this mountain assumes one thing. It assumes you still have a choice. It assumes that when you see the ramp, you can still steer for it. And when you want to slow down, the truck will listen. And every so often, a driver comes over the top of Old Fort Mountain and finds out that his choices are already gone. Staying alive on a grade like this comes down to a few things, and none of them are complicated. You come down in a low gear, the same gear you would need to climb it. You let the engine and the driveline do the braking, so your service brakes stay cool and stay yours. Because a loaded truck on a 6% grade is a physics problem, and the physics do not negotiate. You have got 80,000 pounds trying to go downhill, and the only thing standing between that weight and the bottom is heat. Every time you tap the brakes to scrub speed, you are dumping energy into those drums as heat. Ride them too long, feather them the whole way down instead of gearing down properly, and the drums cook. The linings glaze, and somewhere on that hill, you push the pedal, and there is just nothing there. That is the whole game. The drivers who come down Old Fort in the right gear come down bored. The drivers who come over the top too hot in too high a gear, thinking they will just manage it on the brakes, are writing the first sentence of an accident report. And the cruel thing is, it is almost never the rookie. The rookie is terrified. The rookie stops at the sign, reads every word, crawls down at 35 with his hazards on. It is experience that kills you here. It is the driver who has done 10,000 grades, who is coming down this one a little too fast because he has always gotten away with it, whose schedule is tight, and whose confidence is a mile wide. This mountain has been separating those two kinds of drivers for 70 years, and it does not care how long you have held your CDL. Which brings us to a Tuesday morning last June, to a man who was not a rookie. A man who had been driving trucks for 30 years, who was not even passing through, who was up in these mountains doing honest work helping this exact region dig out from a disaster. He did almost everything right in his final seconds, and it still was not enough, because by the time he needed the one thing this mountain could not give him back, it was already gone. His name was Ralph Hibbert. He was 65 years old, out of Georgia, and by every account of the people who knew him, he was the real thing. The man who hired him said it plain. Humble, supportive, 30 years of experience behind the wheel. Not a kid, not a four-wheeler who wandered onto a mountain he did not understand. A professional. And Hibbert was not just running freight through here. Western North Carolina had been torn apart by Hurricane Helene, and he was part of the recovery. On the morning of June 17, 2025, his dump truck was loaded with railroad ballast, the crushed stone that goes under railroad track. And that ballast was headed for the rail line between Old Fort and Black Mountain that the storm had wrecked. He was hauling rock to rebuild a railroad. Around 10 in the morning, he started down the eastbound grade into Old Fort. Somewhere on that descent, the brakes let go. To this day, the police cannot say exactly when or where they failed, only that they did. Other truckers were on the mountain with him, and they watched it happen. They saw his dump truck running better than 70 miles an hour down a grade posted at 35 for trucks, holding that speed in the right lane, passing the other rigs who were doing it right. Witnesses said they could see him working the brakes, pumping the pedal, and getting nothing. The truck just kept accelerating. He passed the ramps, All of them. 3 emergency escape ramps on that 5-mile stretch, every one of them built and placed and maintained for this precise moment. And he went by all 3. And I want to be careful here because it is easy to sit in a chair and ask why. The man who hired him is certain Hibbert knew those ramps were there. He knew the mountain. What none of us knows is what a runaway dump truck at 70 plus felt like from inside that cab. Whether he could have made the cut across to a ramp without rolling it. Whether the truck would even do what he asked anymore. Those are the choices this mountain had already taken away from him. By the time he reached the bottom, he was doing an estimated 75 to 80 miles an hour, and he came off the interstate at exit 73. At the bottom of that ramp were other vehicles, stopped, waiting. And this is the part the town of Old Fort has held on to ever since. Ralph Hibbert steered away from them. In his last seconds, out of brakes and out of options, he put the truck somewhere that would not take anyone with him. The dump truck crossed the road, hit an embankment, went airborne, and slammed into a building under construction on Bat Cave Road. Hibbert was thrown from the truck. He died at the scene. No one else was killed. No one else was even hurt. And the people who watched it happen are convinced that is not luck. That is a 30-year professional making the last decision he had left and spending it on strangers. The state later ruled his death a casualty of Hurricane Helene. He became one more name on that storm's toll. A man who survived the flood, only to be taken by the mountain road above it. And there is one piece of this I cannot stop turning over. The load in Hibbert's truck, the crushed stone he died hauling, was going to the railroad. The same railroad line, Old Fort to Black Mountain, that convicts blasted through this mountain 150 years ago. The same grade that took at least 139 lives before there was ever a road here at all. A century and a half apart, the same mountain, the same 9 miles, the same story. Men sent up here to build something, paying for it with their lives. Hibbert was carrying rock to repair the very thing that started the body count, and the mountain collected him on the way. If you wanted to write it into a movie, nobody would believe you. So what do you take off this hill, besides your load? Not that Old Fort cannot be beaten. It can. It gets beaten every single day by hundreds of trucks whose drivers stop at the top, drop a gear, ride the engine down, and never once touch a ramp. The people who built this road did, in the end, win. They put a modern interstate across a wall that used to kill men by the dozen. And most days, it works exactly the way it is supposed to. But the drop is still there. Underneath the smooth pavement and the sweeping curves and the 50 years of warning signs, the east side of Old Fort Mountain still falls away exactly the way it always has. And it is still waiting on the one driver who comes over the top thinking a good road means an easy hill. It does not. It never did. This mountain has been teaching that lesson for 150 years. And it is very patient. And it always eventually gets its point across. So when you crest Old Fort and that grade opens up in front of you, take the warning, drop the gear, come down cold. Because the mountain only asks you for one mistake. Keep the rubber side down and the shiny side up.